Chapter 1. She went back. Most people, once free, would have stayed free. Harriet Tubman did not. In the autumn of 1849, she escaped slavery in Maryland alone, traveling nearly 90 miles on foot, and by boat, guided by the North Star, through darkness and cold, until she reached Philadelphia. She was somewhere around 27 years old. She had never been to the city before. She knew almost no one. She later described that moment in words that were recorded by her early biographer. She said the feeling of reaching freedom was like being in a different world. Then she looked around at all the strangers, and she realized that nobody she loved was there with her, so she went back. Not once, 13 times, according to the most reliable historical record. Each return trip south was punishable by death. She never lost a single person she was guiding. She carried no weapon on the early missions. Her tools were the night, the seasons, her extraordinary knowledge of the land, and a faith so deep and practical that she treated her visions as intelligence briefings from God. This is the true story of Harriet Tubman, conductor, spy, soldier, and stateswoman. It is more remarkable than the myth. Chapter 2. Born enslaved, Maryland's Eastern Shore. Her name at birth was Araminta Ross. Minty, her family called her. She was born around 1822 in Dorchester County on Maryland's Eastern Shore, one of 9 children of Harriet Greene called Rit, and Ben Ross, both enslaved on the Thompson and Broad's plantations. The Eastern Shore was flat, low country, wide sky tobacco and cornfields, dense pine forests, tidal creeks threading between the fields. It was also, for enslaved people, a place of close surveillance. Escape was difficult. The Chesapeake Bay lay to the west, slave-catching patrols worked the roads. Minty's earliest years were marked by the threat of sale that hung over every enslaved family. Her enslaver, Edward Broads, hired her out as a child to other households, as a nursemaid, as a muskrat trapper who waded the cold creeks in winter. These were not the years of childhood she deserved. They were hard labor, unpaid, enforced. She could not read or write, but she learned the land, its paths, its marshes, the way light moved across the flat fields at different hours. That knowledge would one day save dozens of lives. She would also, in these years, absorb something that no enslaver could take from her, a deep faith rooted in the Methodist Church, and an inner life fierce enough to outlast everything that was done to her. Chapter 3. The Blow That Never Healed. When Araminta was around 13 years old, something happened that would shape the rest of her life. She was in a general store when an enslaved man ran in, trying to escape. An overseer followed and reached for a lead weight, intending to throw it at the fleeing man. The weight missed and struck Minty in the forehead. The blow fractured her skull. She was not treated by a doctor. She was sent back to work, while still bleeding, unconscious at intervals. For months she suffered seizures, violent headaches, and sudden, unstoppable episodes of falling asleep mid-sentence, mid-step, mid-conversation. These episodes never left her. For the rest of her long life, she lived to at least 90. She would fall into sudden sleep and wake minutes later, having seen visions. Modern medical researchers, reviewing historical accounts, believe the injury caused post-traumatic narcolepsy. Tubman herself understood what she experienced in the language of faith. She believed the visions were messages from God, warnings and guidance that she should obey. Whether one calls it a neurological condition or prophetic gift, the outcome was the same. When a voice in her mind said, "Go this way," or "Stop here, danger," she listened. On the Underground Railroad, that listening saved lives. The injury that was meant to diminish her became, in some way she could not have foreseen, part of what made her extraordinary. Chapter 4. John Tubman, and a Marriage Made on Uncertain Ground. Around 1844, Araminta Ross married a free black man named John Tubman. She took his surname, and around this time, she also took her mother's first name, Harriet. She was Harriet Tubman now, and the name would mean something to history. The marriage was complicated from the start. Harriet was enslaved and John was free. The law that bound her did not bind him. He had no legal power to prevent her from being sold south. When Harriet began to think seriously about escape, John reportedly threatened to tell their enslaver if she tried. Whether from fear for himself or lack of faith that she could succeed, he would not join her. She left without him in 1849. When she later returned in a secret mission to bring him north, she found that he had already remarried. She gathered other family members instead and continued. John Tubman died in 1867 in an altercation with a white man. In 1869, Harriet married again, Nelson Davis, a Union Army veteran, and former enslaved man from North Carolina who boarded at her Auburn home. They married at the Central Presbyterian Church in Auburn and remained together until his death in 1888. In 1874, they adopted a baby girl, Gertie. These personal facts matter because they remind us behind the legend was a human being who loved, was disappointed, built a life after loss, and endured. Chapter 5. Her Own Escape, 1849. In September 1849, Harriet Tubman learned she might be sold. Her enslaver, Edward Broads, had died earlier that year, and there was talk of the estate being broken up. She decided she would not wait to find out. She set out with two of her brothers, Ben and Henry, but they turned back after a few days, afraid. She continued alone. For roughly a week, she traveled at night and hid by day, in haystacks, in the floors of sympathizers' homes, in dense woodland. She navigated by the North Star, Polaris, always north, and by the moss growing on the north sides of trees. She received help from individuals in the loose, informal network of free black people, and white abolitionists later called the Underground Railroad, a system of hiding places, sympathetic households, and secret signals stretching from the slave states to the free North. She crossed into Pennsylvania and reached Philadelphia. The journey was approximately 90 miles. Years later, her words about arriving were recorded by biographer Kate Clifford Larson. She described looking at her hands to see if she was the same person, because everything felt so different, and everything looked so like glory about her. She had her freedom. She wanted her family to have it too. Chapter 6. The network, how the Underground Railroad worked. The Underground Railroad was not an underground railroad. It was a loose, decentralized network of people, mostly free African Americans, some white Quakers, and abolitionists who sheltered, fed, guided, and financed freedom seekers moving north. When Harriet Tubman reached Philadelphia, she connected with this network. At its center, in that city, was William Still, a free black man born in New Jersey to formerly enslaved parents, who worked as secretary of Philadelphia's Vigilance Committee and kept meticulous records of every freedom seeker who passed through his hands. His 1872 book, The Underground Railroad, remains a primary historical source. Tubman also worked with Thomas Garrett, a Quaker station master in Wilmington, Delaware, a crucial stop on the route north, and with Frederick Douglass in Rochester, New York, and Germain Loguen in Syracuse. These were not romantic adventurers. They were organizers, funders, and risk-takers who made the network function. What made Tubman exceptional was not just her courage but her operational skill. She chose the right season, often winter, when long nights offered cover. She chose the right day, Saturday, because reward notices could not be published until Monday, giving her an extra 36 hours. She planned routes carefully, always having an alternative. The network trusted her. She never lost a traveler. Chapter 7. Going back, the rescue missions. Between December 1850 and 1860, Harriet Tubman returned to Maryland's eastern shore approximately 13 times to guide people out of slavery. Historians, including Kate Clifford Larson and Catherine Clinton, working from William Still's records, Thomas Garrett's letters, and contemporary news accounts, estimate she directly freed approximately 70 people, family members, neighbors, strangers who trusted her. These numbers should be stated plainly, because they have often been inflated. The popular claim that she freed more than 300 people is not supported by the historical record. The National Park Service has been explicit about this. The exaggeration began with figures cited in an 1868 biography by Sarah Bradford, who was fundraising for Tubman's support and appears to have overstated the numbers. The actual figure, around 70 people personally guided to freedom, is remarkable without embellishment. Each mission was different. Her first, in December 1850, was to rescue her niece Keziah and Keziah's 2 children, who were about to be auctioned. She coordinated with Keziah's free husband, John Bowley, to spirit them away before the auction closed. Later missions brought out her brothers, her parents, her father, Ben Ross. She guided north in 1854 and dozens of others. She was, as she was nicknamed, Moses. The comparison to the biblical liberator was not accidental. It was exact. Chapter 8. How She Moved. Tactics and Faith. Tubman's methods were practical, disciplined, and shaped by close knowledge of the land where she grew up. She traveled in winter, when nights were longest and cornfields offered no hiding. She departed on Saturday nights. Reward notices could not be placed in Monday edition papers until Sunday evening, giving her a head start. She varied her routes. When leading a group, she sometimes disguised herself and others as a free family traveling openly. She carried a pistol in later missions, less for attacking anyone, several accounts suggest. Then because she would not allow a terrified group member to turn back and endanger the rest. Her narcoleptic episodes, those sudden descents into vivid sleep, she treated as divine warnings. If a vision told her to take a different road, she took a different road. Whether this was neurological pattern recognition or something else entirely, the fact is that she and the people with her arrived safely, every time. Faith was not separate from strategy. It was woven through it. She was a deeply Methodist woman who prayed aloud and quoted scripture and understood herself as an instrument. Her reported maxim, that she never ran her train off the track and never lost a passenger, was not boast but testimony. 13 missions, approximately 70 people, 0 lost. The record speaks. Chapter 9. The Fugitive Slave Act, The Route Moves North. In September 1850, the United States Congress passed the Fugitive Slave Act. It was one of the most vicious laws in American history. Under its terms, enslaved people who had escaped to free northern states could be recaptured and returned to slavery, and any citizen who helped them could be fined or imprisoned. This made Philadelphia no longer safe. Cities like Boston and New York were no longer safe. The only sure haven was Canada, beyond the reach of us law. Tubman adapted. She extended her routes north, past Philadelphia, past the New York Abolitionist Network, across the border into Ontario. St. Catharines, in what is now Ontario, became her base of operations for several years. The journey was now hundreds of miles longer. The risk was greater. She went anyway. Frederick Douglass, who had himself escaped slavery and become the most prominent black abolitionist in the country, wrote to her in 1868 in a letter preserved in the historical record, saying that the difference between her work and his was this: he could only speak about the darkness. She had lived in it, moved through it, led others through it, while those who would have done anything to stop her searched in vain. The Fugitive Slave Act made free black people in the North vulnerable, in ways that are hard to fully imagine. Tubman responded by going further north and going back south more often. Chapter 10. The Legend and the Facts, Correcting the Myths. 2 myths have attached themselves to Harriet Tubman's story and are still repeated widely. Both should be corrected, because her actual record needs no exaggeration. The first is the claim that she freed more than 300 people. This number originated with Sarah Bradford's 1868 fundraising biography. Historians working from the most complete contemporary records, William Still's ledgers, Thomas Garrett's letters, newspaper notices, and Underground Railroad accounts, put the number at approximately 70 people directly guided by Tubman herself, plus others who followed routes she described. 70 people, each one a life, each mission a mortal risk. It does not need inflating. The second is the claim that slaveholders posted a $40,000 bounty for her capture. This figure cannot be found in any contemporary source. The only documented reward for Tubman, then known as Minty Ross, was a $100 per person advertisement placed in the Cambridge Democrat in October 1849, after her first escape. The $40,000 figure was invented by a New York anti-slavery activist named Sally Hawley in 1867, in a letter lobbying for Tubman's army pension, and grew from there. The National Park Service and historians, including Kate Clifford Larson, have documented this clearly. The truth is sufficient. The legend is in the way of it. Chapter 11. War. Harriet Tubman Goes South Again. When the Civil War began in 1861, Harriet Tubman understood it as the context she had been working toward her whole adult life. She was around 39 years old. She had already done more than most people do in a lifetime. She was not finished. In May 1862, the governor of Massachusetts, John Andrew, arranged for Tubman to travel to Port Royal, South Carolina, a coastal area held by Union forces, where tens of thousands of formerly enslaved people had come under federal protection. She went first as a nurse, preparing remedies from local plants, tending the sick and wounded. She sold pies and home-brewed root beer in the evenings to support herself, since the army paid her nothing. But her usefulness to the Union went far beyond nursing. She had an extraordinary skill that the army needed desperately. She could move through hostile territory without detection, build trust with local people, and gather intelligence. She had been doing exactly this for a decade on the eastern shore of Maryland. She began recruiting a network of local scouts, men from the Sea Islands who spoke Gullah, the Creole language of the Low Country, and knew the rivers, swamps, and plantation roads in ways that no white Union officer could. Among them, Peter Barnes, Sandy Salters, Solomon Gregory, Isaac Hayward, and pilots Samuel Hayward and Charles Simmons. Tubman ran them. She was, in modern intelligence terms, a human terrain specialist and agent handler. Chapter 12. Spy and Scout, Intelligence Behind Confederate Lines. Through 1862 and into 1863, Harriet Tubman worked as a spy and intelligence operative for the Union Army in South Carolina's Department of the South, under the command of General David Hunter. The intelligence she gathered was specific and actionable. By interviewing the hundreds of formerly enslaved people reaching Union lines, debriefing them. In modern terminology, she assembled detailed knowledge of Confederate positions, supply routes, river channels, and plantation layouts. She knew what questions to ask, and she knew, from her own experience, which information would be true. In March 1863, she led a scouting party of 8 men on a mission that produced intelligence directly used in the Union capture of Jacksonville, Florida. She had become, in all but official title, a commissioned military operative. The Army did not pay her. She received no salary. She received no pension during the war. She sold food she made herself to survive, and she continued working. This was not unusual for black women serving the Union cause. The gap between their contribution and their official recognition was vast and deliberate. Tubman spent decades after the war petitioning Congress for the back pay and pension she was owed. She did not receive a pension until 1899, and then only through a pension granted as the widow of her husband Nelson Davis, a Union Army veteran, rather than for her own service. Chapter 13. The Combahee River Raid, June 2, 1863. On the night of June 2, 1863, 3 Union gunboats moved up the Combahee River in South Carolina. On board was Colonel James Montgomery of the 2nd South Carolina Infantry, a regiment of formerly enslaved men. And navigating the river, Harriet Tubman. She knew where the Confederate torpedoes, underwater mines, had been placed. Her scout network had provided the intelligence. The boats threaded through the mined waters without incident. At several plantations along the river's banks, the boats came to shore. Word spread instantly among the enslaved population. People ran from the fields, from the slave quarters, from the rice paddies, carrying children, elderly relatives, whatever they could grab. When the boats departed, they carried approximately 700 to 800 formerly enslaved men, women, and children. It was one of the largest single emancipations of the Civil War. Harriet Tubman was the first woman known to have planned and led a U.S. armed military raid. This is not disputed by serious historians. It is documented in military records, contemporary newspaper accounts, and eyewitness testimony. The Boston Commonwealth ran a report on the raid in July 1863 that described her role explicitly. Colonel Montgomery reportedly attributed the success of the operation directly to Tubman's intelligence work and navigation. She was 41 years old. She had been doing this kind of work for 14 years. Chapter 14. The Cost of Freedom. What the War Took. The Civil War was not glorious in the living of it. Harriet Tubman served in South Carolina from 1862 until at least late 1863. Some accounts suggest her involvement continued into 1864. She nursed soldiers, Union, and when wounded Confederates were in Union hands, those men too. She worked in hospitals dealing with typhoid, dysentery, smallpox. She prepared herbal remedies from local plants, some of which may have been effective, and some of which she learned from enslaved people with long generations of medical knowledge. She contracted typhoid fever herself at some point during her service and was seriously ill. She recovered. All of this, the intelligence work, the raids, the nursing, the months away from Auburn, was done for no pay beyond what she could earn selling food she made herself. The United States Army did not give her a salary. The pension office did not recognize her service. When the war ended in April 1865 and she made her way home to Auburn, she traveled on a reduced-rate military pass, and the conductor threw her out of her seat in a Jim Crow confrontation and injured her arm. Freedom, won on the Combahee River for 700 souls, did not yet extend to the woman who had guided it there. She understood this with clear eyes. She continued anyway. Chapter 15. After the War, Auburn, Family, and the Fight for Pay. After the war, Harriet Tubman settled in Auburn, New York, in a house she had purchased, on favorable terms arranged by the New York senator and abolitionist William Seward, before the war. It was the first home she had ever owned. She filled it immediately. Her aged parents moved in. Extended family arrived. She ran a boarding house to generate income. It was how she met Nelson Davis, who boarded there in 1866 and became her husband in 1869. They adopted a baby daughter, Gertie, in 1874. E.T. Jusaidu, too. She was also broke. The pension case that should have been straightforward. A woman who had provided 13 years of active service to the Union cause was an administrative nightmare. Congress showed no urgency. She petitioned repeatedly over the following decades. She received nothing for her own service, the $20. Permanent pension she eventually received in 1899 was classified as a widow's pension from Nelson Davis's service, not her own. She did not let the injustice make her bitter. It made her busier. She began giving speeches in support of women's suffrage. She attended women's rights conferences in Boston, New York, and Washington. She appeared at the first meeting of the National Association of Colored Women in 1896. She was in her 70s. She had, by almost any measure, already done enough. She continued because the work was not done. Chapter 16. Suffrage, the Next Freedom. Harriet Tubman had always understood that freedom was not a single event. It was a direction. After the Civil War, she became an active voice in the women's suffrage movement, a cause that intersected with, and sometimes collided with, the campaign for black civil rights. The two were not always the same thing. Some white suffragists were willing to accept black disenfranchisement if it served their immediate political aims. Tubman was not confused about this. She wanted the vote for all women and full civil rights for all black Americans, and she said so plainly. She spoke at conventions in Boston, Washington, and New York. She addressed the first meeting of the National Association of Colored Women in 1896, an organization founded by Mary Church Terrell and others to fight both racism and sexism simultaneously. She was in her 70s when she gave these speeches, decades after most people might have considered their public life finished. She never got to vote. The 19th Amendment, granting women the vote, passed in August 1920, 7 years after her death. She had spent the last decade of her life working towards something she would not live to see. This is not a sad ending. It is how most of the important work of history gets done, by people who will not personally collect the reward. Chapter 17. The Home for the Aged, Giving the Last Things Away. In the years after the war, Harriet Tubman had very little money and owned one thing of value: the land she lived on in Auburn. She decided to give it away. In 1903, she deeded her additional property, the land adjacent to her home, to the African Methodist Episcopal Zion Church. Her intention was that it should be used as a home for elderly, infirm black men and women who had nowhere else to go. The Amy Zion Church opened the Tubman Home for Aged and Infirm Negroes in 1908. When she was asked, reportedly, why she had donated rather than selling the land, she said, in an account preserved in church records, that she had helped herself, and it was time to help others who needed it. In the last 2 years of her own life, Tubman moved into the home she had founded. She was cared for by the same institution she had given her property to create. It was entirely consistent with how she had lived, spending herself in the service of other people, receiving what came back without embarrassment. She lived in John Brown Hall, the original building of the home, until her death. She is said to have told the friends gathered around her, in the weeks before the end, not to grieve, that she was going home. Chapter 18. Legacy, What She Changed, and What We Owe Her. Harriet Tubman died of pneumonia on March 10, 1913. She was buried at Fort Hill Cemetery in Auburn, New York. She was somewhere between 88 and 93 years old, depending on which estimate of her birth year you accept. Her legacy is not primarily a list of numbers. It is a demonstration of what one person, with almost no institutional support, and operating against the most powerful legal and social forces in her country, could do by being absolutely clear about what was right and refusing to stop. She freed approximately 70 people directly in 13 missions under conditions that would have broken most people after one. She planned and led the Combahee River Raid, freeing nearly 700 more, the largest single emancipation of the Civil War, executed with military precision by a woman the Army would not officially pay. She nursed soldiers, gathered intelligence, campaigned for women's votes, founded a home for the elderly, and died in the institution she had given her land to create. In 2016, the U.S. Treasury announced that Tubman would replace Andrew Jackson on the face of the $20 bill. As of this book's writing, the bill has not been issued. Whether currency is the right measure of a legacy is debatable. The Underground Railroad is the measure. The Combahee River is the measure. The 70 lives, the 700 lives. Harriet Tubman is the measure. Chapter 19. What we really know and where the record is thin. The historical record of Harriet Tubman's life is better than many figures from her era, and still full of gaps. We do not know her exact birth date or year. Documents from the period of slavery were kept, when at all, by enslavers, not the enslaved. The census records of the 1820s, 1840s in Dorchester County do not identify Tubman by name. Historians have worked from estate records, runaway advertisements, and Tubman's own accounts to reconstruct the facts. And they disagree on some dates. We know her missions from William Still's records, Thomas Garrett's letters, and contemporary abolitionist correspondence, sources that are reliable but incomplete. Some of the stories attached to her name come from Sarah Bradford's two fundraising biographies, 1869 and 1886, which were written to generate income for Tubman, and were not always careful with numbers. The reported speech attributed to her in this book, including the line about never losing a passenger, is tradition recorded decades after the fact by people who knew her. It should be read as a characterization, not a verbatim transcript. We have not invented quotes. Harriet Tubman was fully literate in the most important possible way, in people, in landscape, in danger and safety, in the language of faith and courage. She could not read or write. What she said was recorded by others, filtered through their ears and their purposes. The woman in the record is real. She is also, to some degree, constructed by others. Both things are true. Chapter 20. A Woman of the 19th Century and Every Century Since. Harriet Tubman was born into a system designed to own her entirely, her labor, her children, her name, her future. She understood the system precisely and defeated it, personally, for herself, and for approximately 70 people she led out by hand, and for hundreds more she liberated in the Combahee River Raid, and in ways that cannot be fully counted, for everyone who came after. She did this as a woman of devout Methodist faith, with a brain injury that caused her to fall asleep without warning, and see vivid visions, with no formal education, with no salary from the governments she served, and with a $100 reward, not $40,000, on her head for much of it. The figure who has emerged in American cultural memory is heroic enough to be abstract. A statue, a symbol, a face on a bill that may or may not be issued. What this book has tried to do is return her to human scale, which is the only scale at which she is truly impressive, a real woman doing impossible things, in real darkness and real cold, for real people whose names were also recorded by William Still. If you want to look them up, Keziah Ben, Henry John, Harriet, Rachel. The 70 people she walked out of slavery have names. They too are the legacy. Harriet Tubman died in 1913. Everything she reached for is still unfinished. That too is part of the legacy. A note on history and sources. This book follows the documented historical record. Where a popular story is legend rather than established fact, we say so plainly. Two widely repeated claims are not supported by the evidence. The first, that Tubman freed more than 300 people, traces to a fundraising biography. Historians estimate about 70 people she guided directly. The second, that a $40,000 bounty was placed on her, appears in no contemporary source. The only documented reward was $100 advertised in 1849. The truth needs no exaggeration. Tubman could not read or write, so her words survive only as others recorded them, often years later. Quotations attributed to her, including "I never lost a passenger," are best read as faithful tradition, not verbatim transcript. No quotations have been invented for this book. Even her birth year is uncertain, about 1822, because under slavery it was enslavers, not the enslaved, who kept the records. The illustrations in this book are artistic interpretations created with the assistance of artificial intelligence. They are not photographs or historical portraits. About Griot. Griot tells the true stories of African and Black history, with the care they deserve, researched, sourced, and beautifully illustrated. Copyright 2026. Published independently via Grio.